אוקיי. So, ערב טוב לכולם, ברוכים הבאים לוובינר של פורום היום שאחרי המלחמה. I'm going to say a few words in Hebrew, and then we'll switch to English, which is the language for our current session today. פורום היום שאחרי המלחמה תומך, מקדם ופועל למען פתרון כולל ביטחוני, מדיני, ליום שאחרי המלחמה. אם אתם עדיין לא מקבלים את העדכונים שלנו, את התוכנית שלנו, את הפעולות שלנו, אז יהיה פה בצ'אט וביוטיוב למטה בקומנטס לינקים, ותראו את הפעילויות שלנו. אחד הדברים שאנחנו עושים מדי שבוע, זה מפגש כזה בסדרה הזאת, עם מומחים מהארץ ומהעולם, המומחים הטובים בתחומם, שאיתם אנחנו מבקשים לתת תשובות לשאלות קריטיות וחשובות בהקשר של היום שאחרי המלחמה, וזה מה שאנחנו גם נעשה היום. So, I'm going to switch to English now. Just let me see if Tomer is here. Okay. So, good evening once again. We are here tonight in another session in the webinar series of the Day After the War Forum. This is a forum of researchers that was established immediately after October 7th. Each week we work through this webinar, but through many other channels in order to present a plan and advance a plan for the end of the war. And one of the things that we have noticed that is missing in the public debate or within the public debate is solid knowledge about how wars ends around the world. What can we learn from the experience, harsh experience of other places, and what lessons can we draw from it to our current state of affairs. So for this reason, we have tonight with us two exceptional experts, each of which has researched the role of different players in ending wars, and we'll focus first with Cristin Cheng from King's College University, which we are so privileged to have with us tonight. Again, Dr. Cheng, I really appreciate you joining us. I don't take that as trivial. She's a scholar of wars. That's her field of expertise, and she has written award-winning books. And tonight, I wanted her to focus on the role of third parties, on third states, on their role in resolving international or ethnic disputes. And so just today we have witnessed Thomas Biden's explanation about President Biden's doctrine, and we understand, as we know from the first day since October 7th, but of course even before, that America plays a significant role within this context. But let us not discuss the specifics of our conflict right now. Let's have a broader look with you on the role of third states, and the floor is yours. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Ronit. Can you hear me okay? Okay, excellent. I am going to share my screen in a second, but first of all, just let me say what a privilege it is to be speaking to all of you. I'm really heartened, actually, that you've put this together. And as somebody that has worked on conflict for over 20 years, I think it's a really tough time for all of you. And I'm very sorry for what has happened. I'm sorry for everybody actually involved in any way and who's been affected by this, because it's hard on all sides. And you've all been through a deep trauma and you are still going through it. And so what I want to do in this conversation today is actually, sorry, let me explain that my fingers are sprained. So this is why you've got this weird funny tape. But I wanted to take you through a conversation that is just a little bit more detached and removed, because I think many of you are scholars. And so, changing the frame of analysis a bit and giving a little bit of distance and trying to put some language to this for other cases, right? Because sometimes it's easier to see your own cases actually by thinking about other places in the world, and by thinking about this as a problem that is a little bit more removed. And I know that's hard to do right now emotionally, but and I'll say a little bit more about that too. But I think this will give you maybe a slightly different perspective on it. So let me try and attempt to share my screen. Tell me if this works. Is that good?
We can see it, but if you can
I'm going to put it on the slideshow.
Display, yes, slideshow.
Yeah. Is that good now?
Sorry, it isn't.
No, you can't see the.
We see like
you need to switch. You need to switch.
You need to switch the display.
I need to switch the display. Hold on a second. Yeah.
Usually it's somewhere on the top, on the left of your screen. Should be switch display or something like this.
Show
or
taskbar?
Display settings.
No.
Maybe
you know why? It's because I've got two screens going, and I think it's going to my other screen as well.
Right.
Hold on a second. Let me just unplug the other screen, and that might solve the problem. I have many cords here and many screens. Let me see if this works.
If not, we can deal with that. It's
Does
okay.
that work?
Well, smaller slides, but don't get into trouble with it.
It's so weird because it shows up perfectly on mine. And you'd think after.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah.
Does that work?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. I have no idea what I just did, but I think I got rid of my other monitor, and that solved part of the problem. Okay, here we go. So, yeah, different moment, right? But we'll just keep that in the back of our minds. You know, what was once possible, what once felt possible. Okay, so I want to do a few things with you today in this discussion. So the first is just to think about different tools and concepts in language for thinking about conflict. And then I want to say a few words about international intervention, third parties. And just this was prompted from what Ronit asked me to think about, and lots of questions that have come up. And then just to say a few things about a few other cases in the world that might be sort of close to what you're going through. Every conflict is unique, but there are some similarities to how we're thinking about these things based on these other cases. Okay. So I'm going to go through I went through the objectives. We'll say a few words about definitions, and then an idea from psychology that actually might help some of you right now. And then how do you get to peace? And a few words about external interventions, other cases, and some conclusions there. So the first question that I think is helpful to ask is, what do you think peace is? And there are lots of ways to think about that are not always intuitive. Some of that can be just the most basic level of the absence of armed competitive violence, right? So that's just, there's no war. But there are lots of other ways to think about peace. And in the context of civil war, it is helpful, I think, for all of you to have in mind, what does the end point look like? So what would a successful version of peace look like? And I think right now it probably just looks like, the absence of large-scale armed violence. But at some point, it'll look like something different. And I think before October the 7th, you probably had, if I'd asked you this question, what does a successful peace look like? You would have had a different idea about that, right? So at some point, people's ideas of what peace is and what it could mean, it changes. And that's another thing important to keep in mind. So most people, it's just the very, very basics. But a different way to think about this too is about the absence of physical violence. And I'm not just talking about rockets and bombs and shootings of one army against another, or one terrorist group against the state, or so on and so forth. But, you know, I'm talking also about other kinds of violence that happen in our lives, right? Police brutality, we're talking about military brutality, we're talking about criminal violence, sexual violence, all sorts of things. And then if we want to expand on that, thinking about positive peace, right? So this absence of structural violence is also like a way in which scholars who look at peace and conflict think about this. So this is, you know, when things are working really well, then we have higher aims, right? We're looking at the absence of structural violence in terms of discrimination and being able to actually fulfill our human, human security goals, and human development goals. That's way in the future, but it's something, you know, that we all would broadly think about as trying to reach for more in terms of peace. But these three big ideas, just different kinds of violence in which we're talking about specifically here, you know, that large scale kind of violence between two armed factions, and then, you know, that ability to sustain that level of violence with, and usually this is about the large scale stuff. That's one level. But there is a second level, which I think is really important in this particular conflict. And that has to do with violence that is basically given to particular actors in society, usually at the elite level. And that's the kind of violence that you are allowed, that is sanctioned by whatever however it is that you think about the way things work, the rules of the game, whatever negotiation you've managed to settle on. So you might think of this as, and I can tell you just, describing this in the United States, for example, right? A certain level of police brutality that is absolutely embedded in the political settlement between Blacks and whites, right? That there is some amount of that is just accepted within the system and just is institutional and continues, right? So you can think about this. I can describe different militaries around the world too, where that kind of violence is just part of the landscape and people know it. And the people who have that power know that they have that power, and the people that are victims of that kind of violence also know that often the police, the military, the security establishment are allowed to do that by the state, right? So this is part of also how we think about violence. And then there is that kind of lower level of permissive violence. Oftentimes we might think about criminal violence that goes on and, nobody tries too hard to stop, you just accept it as part of the landscape, or domestic violence or rape. A lot of that just goes on, violence against children. This is just kind of below that level, right? But not sanctioned by the state necessarily. So all of these types of violence, to varying degrees, some of you may have experienced. You'll see it in the society around you, and you'll certainly see it, within both the West Bank and Gaza to different extents. But it's helpful to think about these kinds of violence. So I want to say a few words here just about this idea of the empathy gap. And I think partly, I was thinking about what would help all of you right now. And part of what I think is going on is it's very difficult. And in part, it's difficult because there is an empathy gap going on. So why is peace so hard? If we can see that there is suffering, then why is it so hard to end violence? And this is true both from the outside, but also, for those who are experiencing it. Why is it so hard to empathize with those from other groups and hard to build trust as you try to move beyond this? And I want to give you some really interesting research from the social psychology side. So this is from an experiment that was done by a professor who's sadly now deceased, but his name was Emile Bruno, and he did this work, over 10 years ago. But he ran a lab experiment, and he had two different teams basically playing video games, right? He just randomly took a group of people, separated them into two random teams, and then gave them colors and a logo, and they played an online video game against each other. They did a little bit of prepping about the other side, about the good and bad things that happened to the people on each side, and then they rated these anecdotes. And then what they did was they affiliated these anecdotes with the team logo, right? So this basically brought up an association of identity with them. And these are, remember, people who've never met each other, completely random. And what he found was really interesting, because he found that there was a lot less empathy, right? Less joy at the successes, less sorrow at the misfortunes for the people on the other team than for members of their own team, right? Or for that control group that hadn't been assigned to anything, right? So this empathy gap is really important, and it has nothing actually to do with a person's innate ability to empathize. It had nothing to do with whether or not somebody was more or less empathetic to start with. And it really just had to do with the strength of your ability to identify with your group. The more you felt that group identity through the colors and the logo, and that's basically all they got, right? Colors and a logo. Then the less empathy that you're likely to feel for members of the other side. So even in something as simple as this, you can actually generate an empathy gap, right? Random people, random kind of, game, silly online game. If you're thinking about it at that level, what is going on then in our brains when you have something that is real and deeper and hurts and has been ongoing now for many, many, many decades? So just thinking about that, he came up with this idea of an empathy gap. And when you're considering an enemy, the mind generates that empathy gap, and that mutes our ability to empathize. It puts ourselves in a really difficult position when we're trying to think about how the other side feels. And this is just a really hard time, right? So it can work in lots of different ways. And he wanted to figure out, hey, does it actually improve pro-social behavior amongst individuals through that increasing empathy, or does it just boost your individual empathy for your own group? And he found that basically it did the latter, right? It boosted your empathy for your own group, and it increased hostility toward the enemy. And so that empathy gap, is part of what is very much seems to be a human kind of process. This is not, unique to Israelis or Palestinians. It's just part of being human. Okay, getting to peace. So getting to the thing that Ronit has asked me to talk about, how do you actually end a war? How do you move from war to peace? So when I've done some work with the UK government, we ran a very large project. It started in about 2016, and we finished the project about 2018. And a good chunk of that work was built on about 20 case studies. There's I can send you the slides later, but there's a link to this project, or you can just Google it and you'll see all of the documents. But there are about 20 case studies online, and some of which are helpful to read in thinking about the end of the war. But I'm just going to give you some of the ideas that came out of the work that we did there. Part of this was the stuff that I just introduced to you around the different types of violence and thinking that through. And I'm going to pull through some more concepts for you. But the first thing is just to separate out processes, actors, and types of violence. So we've already talked about the types of violence, but part of what you're thinking through here is processes, right? So what kind of processes are we going to talk about? And I'll describe them more to you in a second: political settlements, elite bargains, and peace processes. So this is discrete kind of, word. These have specific meanings in the way that we use them in the peace and conflict field. And I'll tell you a little bit more about how they fit together in a moment. But thinking about the kinds of actors who are active in this space, we've got different levels of national, subnational, and transnational actors, conflict actors. We need to think about their interests here. And then we need to think about their incentives and disincentives to use violence in order to pursue those interests. And then here, there's a specific term that I want you to think about, and that's the holding power of actors in order to be able to pursue those interests. So this idea of holding power is particularly important here, and it has to do with what you can, the kind of coercive power that you can generally use against the other side if you need to. That's your ability to kind of bring together your side so that if needed, you can use it against the other side. And if you're thinking about, say, for example, Hamas here, they have a tremendous amount of holding power, right? And that cannot be discounted, that they have the ability to sustain itself economically through conflict. They can inflict costs on both other organizations on their own side, but also on the opposing side. They can absorb all kinds of costs. They can remobilize and keep their members committed. And thinking about how that holding power is sustained and being able to accurately assess that holding power is actually really important to thinking about how you bring an end to war. So if we think about some of the work that we were doing coming out of those 20 case studies, we really thought very hard about power, right? The starting point of the conversation being power and not institutions, and thinking about where does power lie, and disaggregating all of the different agents involved, the structures involved, the institutions involved, and thinking about the relationships between the different actors, both on your own side, and then also on the opposing side, and then also more broadly within the international community, and then how all of those things mix together. And then to some extent, what's going on in the battlefield also really matters, and how it affects the negotiations. So you're taking all of this into account when you're thinking about what is possible. So when is violence due to a lack of a political deal, and when is it actually part of the deal, right? So sometimes this is, again, like I said before, embedded into the deal, that violence is part of the deal. And then when we're talking about external actors, if you're thinking about the US, the UN, the EU, whoever it is, regional powers, it's important to bear in mind that nobody's neutral. Sometimes people cast themselves as neutral, but nobody is neutral. Everybody has got interests. How they express those interests is another thing, and they can, maybe not be quite as partial. But this idea of a neutral arbiter is difficult, and generally just doesn't work out very well. But thinking about the international political economy here, it's not just about, even if there are mediators in this, if there are folks who want to arbitrate between the different sides, those who want to intervene and quote unquote help the situation will also have their own interests at stake, and that goes into the dynamic as well. So I wanted to go back to this idea of the peace process, that political settlement, and then the bargain, right? The process is one that it's very straightforward. It is exactly as described. It's about how you get to peace. It's different kinds of bargaining so that people can rely less on violence than they did before. And then this idea of a political settlement is really about power. It's about who has power amongst the different elites. And it's about the distribution of that power and being able to see it clearly, right? That you understand how much power each side has. And sometimes it's really difficult to do from inside when you're on one side of this conflict or the other. And then this idea of the leap bargain is that eventually, if you are able, whatever it is, the deal that you manage to strike, if you are able to get to a deal, you want that distribution of power on the ground to match up with the deal that you actually strike, right? So typically what you might have happen is that, you have two opposing sides. There's a lot of fighting going on. You often reach a stalemate. Neither side realizes they can win this. Maybe they've been fighting for a very, very long time. Take Colombia as an example, right? Fighting for a very, very long time. They've tried multiple times at peace processes. For one reason or another, they fail. And then in the most recent one, which has resulted in a relatively lasting peace, as far as we can see, there were secret negotiations going on. That was part of the formal peace process that then came out and was brought out more openly. But when you're thinking about that quote unquote, what we call the political settlement, that distribution of power on the ground was such that the two sides were very much stalemated. The government of Colombia was not able to defeat the FARC, and the FARC could not defeat the government, right? But both sides were able to continue to do damage to each other. So they were pretty much at a stalemate. Then the question is, what does the deal look like that they reach. And you can do that through a series of negotiations. You can do that with one big kind of final deal. In the case of Colombia, you have mounds of documents, literally, hundreds of pages of what that deal was that they struck. But what you're looking for is that the power on the ground matches the power that you actually, matches the actual, deal that you actually strike politically. So if you manage to do those things, if you manage to have that peace agreement align with the reality of the power on the ground, then you are much more likely to have a peace that is sustainable. And then you have all sorts of questions in here, right? Like about who gets those benefits, how do you describe power, who's included within how you assess that bargain, thinking about who is committed to peace, genuinely committed to peace, who's trying to destroy it. So you have all these questions thinking about that, but that is part of the process. When you get to the stage where you're actually able to have the conversation, these are the kinds of questions you really want to think about. And then sort of interwoven into all of that are three important ideas that help you also, bring further refinement to this. One is about structures. So when I talk about structural factors, these are long-standing, slow-changing factors. It might be demographics, or what the innate resource endowments are, or what the regional dynamics are. Those are things that are really difficult to change and take a long period of time to change. You have institutions, on the other hand, right, that sustain and perpetuate and create the rules of the game that the elites operate within. And then you have agents, right? And this could be, we would think about Netanyahu as an agent here. And he may have, or she may have, her own particular interests that have to do with their own particular political situation, or, the things that they want to achieve. Here's where personalities come in. So thinking about how then that idea of the peace agreement, the political settlement, and then the bargain are woven together in order to stabilize conflict, but also at the same time taking into account your structures, your institutions, and then the power of agents. That's how you get to stabilizing, something as difficult as a war. So the central idea here from that work is that you're looking for more alignment between these things. The more that you take all of this into account, where you have the distribution of power on the ground matching the actual deal, the more likely it is that you are actually going to have a sustainable peace. And that sounds really simple, but it's actually really hard to achieve. So I'll just say a couple of words just to give you a sense of how it has gone wrong in other places, right? So in Afghanistan, they developed, as many of you will remember, an exclusive peace agreement with centralized institutions. And this was Hamid Karzai in 2002 leading that government. But they had very fragmented politics. Violence was very much decentralized. Coercion was decentralized. There was also a massive counterinsurgency going on. There was narco-trafficking. And the US turned a blind eye to a lot of problems. And, the warlord governor, Atta Mohammed Noor, just as an example, was somebody who sat on multiple sides of this conflict, but was really very much a warlord. He kind of personified this idea that you have these warlords out in the hinterland, very far away from Kabul, and they had quite a lot of coercive power, right? So part of the difficulty in striking that elite bargain that they had was that the people who had power on the ground, they didn't have any stake in the elite bargain that was reached. And that was difficult for creating a sustainable peace. Similarly, in Liberia, after the 97 election was won by Charles Taylor, the losing side was basically shut out of power, right? So not including them, they had substantial power on the ground. They had a lot of that holding power that I was describing, and they got nothing out of it. And because they got nothing out of it, they had every incentive then to regroup out in Guinea. A few years later, they came back, starting from kind of 1999 onwards. So 2 short years later, they had already started to regroup and remobilize. You get to 2001, they are attacking the border, right? And then by 2003, you've got, again, another round of civil war. So that misalignment of the distribution of power on the ground and then the actual elite bargain itself, that misalignment then just made it difficult to sustain the peace. So just thinking about disaggregating all of that, and then think about when is there violence due to the lack of a deal and when is violence part of the deal itself, I think is particularly critical in your case. And then moving on to this maybe more difficult question about external actors. There are many, many things that external actors can do. And, you know, I can get into some of the details of this, but some of them are more viable than others, right? So you've got counterinsurgency. You can actually have outside interveners taking part actively on the ground. That was the case in Afghanistan and Iraq, maybe less likely in this particular case. You also have peacekeeping in some cases with either the UN, a regional actor, a coalition of the willing. And this is maybe actually one of those possibilities in this case. I'm not sure that your government, that the Israeli government is ready to stomach this, but it has been, I think, broadly mooted as a possibility. And depending on the circumstances, it is possible that this could be one helpful tool that is available. There's also obviously international mediation, right? So in Sri Lanka, that was tried, and to some extent, maybe in a slightly different world, that particular war would have come up differently, and those mediation efforts could have succeeded. Sanctions, you know, this is another way, another tool of the international community. You can also think about reconstruction and peace dividends, trying to give incentives to different actors on either side of a particular conflict to help them along and to give them an incentive to lay down their arms. And then oftentimes transitional justice is part of what the international community can offer if you need a place outside of the conflict zone in order for justice to be carried out. So The Hague often, you know, with the ICC and reparations as part of that discussion potentially. I mean, obviously in this case too, we've seen the ICJ get involved in your particular conflict. But there are many, many different ways in which outside actors can become more involved. And I think part of the difficulty here is trying to, the sensitivity of this particular case makes it tough for outsiders to get involved. And it's not clear who can and would be willing, given also the broader geostrategic context as well. I think that's another thing that's going on, as well as the upcoming elections in the United States. I think all of those are complicating things. If this war had happened maybe 3 years ago, it would be different. But because we're at the point, I think, in the rivalry between the US and China, and also because of what is going on within the United States with the election, and where Biden is in particular relative to the rest of his party, and then also in relation to the rest of how the American public feels about this particular conflict, he is in a particularly tough spot. So you've got a bunch of other factors that you're dealing with. But thinking about political and diplomatic interventions here, I think most of us think of this as being an upside where outsiders get involved, but in fact, there can actually be a downside where outside actors can actually make things worse. And in part because they can't be neutral, they can actually sometimes exacerbate the situation. So we shouldn't think of outside external involvement in the peace process or ending the war as necessarily being a good thing. It depends on who, how, when, you know, how it's done. And they are often bringing their own interests, and they are not referees to this, right? So not everybody is neutral. Not everybody is in a position to do this kind of work and do it well. And sometimes they can do more harm than good. So just to bear that in mind in terms of who is being involved and who you might want to have involved in this. The other thing is thinking about, how do you craft that piece? And that was the question I asked you at the beginning, right? What do you want coming out of this? And presumably you want something sustainable, but what does that sustainability entail, right? What would the relationship look like? What are you willing to give up? How do you persuade your side to accept things? How do you find a partner on the other side who can persuade those who are the most hardline, right? And that's really, really tough. Right now, you don't have a partner on the other side who is in a good position to negotiate. And that is a core part of the problem, right? That the other side just doesn't exist in a way that they do in a lot of these other conflicts. In most of the conflicts where we've been able to reach a deal, the other side is much more clear. There is an opposition. Here, the opposition is so fragmented, and the bit that is more legitimate, say, in the Palestinian Authority, is not then in alignment necessarily with Hamas, which has the coercive authority. So they are not of a piece together, and that makes this much more difficult. If you had actually a viable opposition to negotiate with that could actually hold its side together, for thinking, for example, about the Taliban, then this would be a slightly different kind of conversation. But that's something to think about too, is actually, it sounds really particularly difficult right now, but you actually need to some extent to empower the other side and help the other side come together and consolidate the other side so that they can actually negotiate with you, and so that they can actually keep, even if you manage to strike a deal, that they are strong enough to hold together and hold up their side of the bargain, right? And here's the other thing, even when you get there, even when you've got a successful bargain, that consolidating of that piece is tough, because people think, oh, you're at the end of this process, everything's done and dusted. But most peace agreements are actually not implemented in full, and that is actually a large part of why countries go back to war after everything. That, and you probably, you all know this better than anybody else, with the Oslo Accords, that part of the difficulty in other places, the M23 in the Democratic Republic of Congo is actually named after the peace agreement that was struck. And because it was not carried out, the group that felt like the bargain was not upheld, configured itself, and then came back and decided to fight again, and became arguably even more powerful. So just thinking about your negotiating partner on the other side, if you look at Nita Yohanna-Rajah's work, she really stresses the importance of the most successful deals that actually get to the end. Actually, a lot of the time you have to really support the other side and give them the capacity to negotiate and help them to get to the deal. Your mediator often will have to do more work to strengthen the weaker side so that you can actually strike a deal where both sides are equally unhappy with the deal. And then just thinking about, in this particular case, the regional conflict systems and all of those dynamics there, because that was obviously part of what triggered the attacks on October the 7th. And then thinking about the pressure points, where is the leverage within both the domestic politics on both sides, both for the Palestinian side and for the Israeli side? Where are those pressure points regionally as well? Where are those pressure points in the United States? And then at what level is it appropriate to engage? As well as thinking about those subnational dynamics, right? So what does this look like in terms of what it means locally, right? How do you get people on side, both within Israeli society and also in the Palestinian civil society? So my last few words really are just saved up for these comparisons. And I was thinking about, what does this look like, right? This is sort of, in a way, it's cast differently as its own unique thing, but it's helpful to think about this as a secessionist sort of conflict. And Sri Lanka is, right now, it looks not dissimilar to me to what is going on, right? So there were several attempts in the Sri Lankan case to get to a sustainable peace. But we all know that the Tamil Tigers were completely annihilated right after the failures of those previous efforts with the peace processes, right, mediated by Norway, and really that looked like they might have succeeded at different points in that process. That's not what turned out in the end, right? That deal wasn't done. And then in the end, Sri Lankan government really felt like it had the upper hand militarily. They went after the Tamil Tigers and effectively they annihilated not just the fighters themselves, but also the civilian population. Many, many, many people died in that. Many civilians died in that particular war. And at the time, if you look back, you'll go back and look at the coverage, you'll see it was also, a lot of people said it was basically a genocide. That word was used in relation to that particular conflict. It was not taken to the ICJ. It was not, formalized as such, but a lot of people used words of genocide to describe that particular war. The outcome now is such that the LTTE, the Tamil Tigers, have basically been struck down. Does not look like they are coming back. If I were to think about what Netanyahu's trying to do, this is probably what he's trying to achieve. It also came at enormous cost of lives and integration and how you can sort of have a post-Civil War state there is incredibly difficult. I think if the Tamil community does not, coexistence is difficult, right? But they clearly lost the war, and a different state of affairs now exists there. If you're thinking about Sudan as another case, there was, again, the same words used, genocide, to describe what happened in Darfur back in the early 2000s. And the Darfuri rebels who then, rose up to try and, deal with what the Sudanese government through a militia was trying to do. Well, that again looked like it had settled down into something, right? That the Sudanese government had basically won that war. And what's interesting now is, almost 20 years later, we see those rebels coming back, actually. And that conflict is renewed, right? So sometimes it looks for a long time like the state is won, or you think you've gotten to a peace, but that peace was a misalignment of sorts. It stayed dormant, and it looked like you had that distribution of power matching up with your quote unquote elite, the elite bargain that was struck. But then over time, what happens is the opposing side rebuilds because there are enough people who are angry, who still feel like the state is discriminating against them, and who find cause and grievance to remobilize because they are being badly treated through that kind of embedded violence, badly treated either by the police, by the security forces, badly treated politically, economically, religiously, and so they have reason to regroup again. And so sometimes it looks like it's stable, and it's actually not, right? So, some would say that people were complacent about your particular conflict, that it looked sort of stable, like it was in a holding pattern, and everybody was celebrating that it was stable, and in fact, it actually wasn't. And so this is another thing to keep in mind about these things. A more hopeful case, let me give you, is that in Northern Ireland, where you had the Unionists and you had the Nationalists. The Unionists were largely made up of the Protestants who wanted to stay a part of the United Kingdom. The Nationalists were the Catholics, and who largely wanted to become part of the rest of the Republic of Ireland. And they were, they had in some ways a very long and brutal fight called, euphemistically called, the Troubles. But that was a very long and violent fight. And that was actually a war that nobody thought would ever end. And I remember growing up and thinking this war is going to go on forever and ever and ever. and then we got to the Good Friday agreements, and it just came as an utter surprise, right? 6 years of negotiations where neither side basically spoke to the other. This was all done through shuttle diplomacy. And then there was a deal. There are a whole bunch of things that made that particular deal possible, not the least of which was that the political leaders on both sides were committed, both in the Republic of Ireland and also within the UK, to making the deal work. But that each side really had to corral the most hard-line militant parts of their population and get them to agree. And part of what happened in that process is the people who were leading the charge for peace for their sides actually ended up doing very badly politically. So sometimes there are political casualties in this process, but the winner was actually that you have peace in Northern Ireland today. I think nobody disagrees about that. And so I want to use that as a hopeful case for comparison for all of you. Okay, so I hope that's a sort of, an overview for some of the things to think about in our discussion.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much. It was fascinating and very relevant. However, I do have a couple of questions, in particular, what the thought about negotiating for peace with a terrorist group such as Hamas. What are we actually talking about? If we're talking about negotiations with Palestinians, Palestinian authorities, that's one thing, but with that terrorist group, is it really relevant? Or is it that the takeaway from what you've said is that we can only hope to destroy them and as less civilians as possible, because there is actually no potential alignment? So just like in 20 seconds, if you could just refer to that, and then we'll move forward, and maybe we'll have some time for questions later.
Yeah, okay. So is it possible to negotiate with terrorists? Absolutely. Absolutely it is. I mean, the FARC were terrorists. That's definitely how the Colombian government talked about them. And they were terrorists, right? They blew up nightclubs in Bogota. That is not the only case. Absolutely in Northern Ireland, the case I was describing, they also, bombed a fair number of civilian locations, both within Northern Ireland, but also in the rest of the UK, right? So these people were absolutely terrorists in both of these deals. And it is absolutely possible to get to that point, but it's not easy. It is not easy. And I can say more about this later, but I want to say, first of all, that it is possible. In part, though, the language and the, how you get to the point, well, this is too fresh a point, I think, right now for all of you to be going through what you're going, I think, emotionally. And it's hard to think about a discussion right after something that has been so traumatic. But the long-term possibility is absolutely there. Absolutely there, even when you feel like you can't imagine it now.
Okay, thank you. Thanks again. And again, I do have many more questions, but in terms of the time, and also it's highly relevant for what you have just said, and that is our moment to switch to Dr. Tomer. Let me just have him spotlighted. Just a second.
Hello, hello.
Yeah, okay. You are spotlighted. Okay, wonderful. So let me just introduce you. Yeah. Okay. So Dr. Tomer Schorr-Liebfeld is a researcher of political prisoners and their potential role in post-war or post-conflict resolution. And I'm thinking that it really connects well with the previous discussion, and I look forward for your presentation of your recent research, which was just published in a highly respected journal. So Tomer, the floor is yours.
Okay, I will, yeah, this is, okay, no, sure. Okay, now do you see my presentation? Okay, now I'll talk about when and how wars end. And I will focus about the role of PMVO issue in transcending protracted conflict. I will use these terms because each of them has a lot of significance. I think you are right that there is a lot of connection between those the previous lecture. So first you helped me because I don't need to introduce myself. I will speak about first about the problem. Is it impossible to transcend protracted conflict? There is a huge difference between interstate conflicts and protracted conflicts that are asymmetrical, ethno-national, and I will speak about it. Afterwards, I'll talk about, of course, the PMVO, the prisoners, definition, characteristic, and their unique jail experience that creates them as the key to solution. Afterwards, I'll talk about their possible impact. About first, they can impact on prolonging the conflict and enhancing it, but also they can help it transcend. And in the end, I'll talk about implementation. I'll talk again about North Ireland and South Africa. I'll also speak about FARC and Sri Lanka. They all appeared in my dissertation. So let's begin. First, the protracted conflict. This is our stubborn conflict that continue for several generations, and they resist any solution. So each time you conclude them with an agreement, the cycle of violence by the extremists pull all the groups down back to violence. So there are several characteristics, many more, but I will focus on 6. First, they are ethno-national. It means that they have deep-rooted causes. And these deep-rooted causes creates taboos, protracted value that people on both sides will say there is no legitimacy for anyone to give that up. For Israelis, the right of return, for the Palestinians to Israel is a protected value. No agreement can get the Palestinians into Israel's borders, but the same value is a protected value for many Palestinians. This creates a problem. It's called the windset problem because it narrows down the mutually acceptable solutions. If you have a protected value from both sides, taboos from both sides, so nobody can give. The deep-rooted causes may also have religious, historical, sentimental things, causes, but at the end, if the society accepts them, so it blocks every chance for a mutual acceptable solution. Second, and it is most important, every one of these conflicts perceived as existential in international relations. We all the time speak about a zero-sum game, but this is not a zero-sum game. It is perceived as us or them. And we can look about now the last question about the Hamas. We perceive it as if we want to survive, Hamas must be perished. In Sri Lanka, if the Sri Lanka want to continue, the Tamil Tigers must be perished. The word is politicide, and politicide has two levels: the genocide horrific level, but not only. In Sri Lanka, what really happened, yes, many were killed, but most importantly, as a polity, they were annihilated, but the civilians became civilians of Sri Lanka. Their politicians became part of the parliament, and so, but as a polity, they cease to exist. So this is politicide on both levels, but at least for every one of the sides in a protracted conflict, the other it perceived as you perceive them, the other side, as one that they want to destroy you completely, and that creates victimhood for both sides. Every side see themselves as the sole victim, and the other side as demon. There is a strong process of the demonization, and this leads to a deep trust issue. This deep trust issue is very strong when you look about suggestions, because if the other side suggests anything, you will that is seem pragmatic. You think there is a trick here. There is you suspect every letter and every suggestion, or there is a trick, or there is a bump, or he won't fulfill his terms. All this creates emotional and psychological ramifications. Of course, there are grievances because the continued conflict. Many of the civilians experienced first-hand or second-hand victimhood. They have high stakes in the political situation. It's not a conflict that is far away. No, it's near for everybody. Everybody knows someone who has been hurt by the other side, and because of that, it is high on the national agenda. on the political agenda. It's not something that can be sidelining. And every of these societies creates mechanisms, and Daniel Bartal have done great research about that for many years, about a coping mechanism that allows societies to endure this the great costs of this conflict. And first and foremost is the patriot traitor line. So in this society, the most in the hierarchy of this society, the most honor is to be the perfect patriot. So the perfect patriot is the one that suffers the most, and or for the in society, and hates the most the other one. And the traitors are on the other side. They are the ones who empathize with the others. Even a simple empathizing is considered a betrayal, and you can't listen to it. In Israel, we see it in censorship, and but you can see it much more strongly in the Palestinian Authority and in Hamas. That if someone empathized with the Israelis that were killed, no, it will be outcast immediately, and we will get back to this place. Another concept is the unity. We must be all united, and we must not and this means that we have to hug our extremists, because we all must be united against the enemy. Memory, victimhood, and for me, I want to emphasize the thing about utopian peace. Every one of these societies creates imagine peace that is, for them it's a perfect solution that will it must be worth all the sacrifices. So it's a utopian peace that all their demands are accepted. For the Palestinians, for many years, even during the height of Oslo, many of them spoke about, yes, we will have peace, and Israel, and all while all the Palestinians from the diaspora could come and live in Israel, and this will be great, and we'll live in peace. Of course, by the Israeli side, everybody, a lot of the people that supported Rabin himself still believe that all the settlements will be left on the ground, and Bekat HaYarden, a huge proportion of this country will stay in Israeli hand. So you imagine utopian peace, and of course, everybody will love everybody. This is a perfect peace. It's not a negotiation, settlement. It's not arrangement. It's not a neighboring states. It's perfect peace. And this utopian peace, every one of these mechanisms is great for the society to hold together while fighting, but every one of them is a mechanism that will deter and will disrupt every solution.
So excuse me for the disruption, Tomer, but please, because we are limited in time, maybe just move to focus on the role of prisoners. I think that would be really appreciated.
Okay, so and I'll try to move fast because I want to say about the when. There is a great problem in finding a solution to this kind of conflicts, and every one of these problems can be solved by the PMVO. So only one thing, and most very, very important, is the problem of they are asymmetric and intermestic. The international and the domestic are intertwined, and it means that you have multi-level negotiations, and the spoilers, the parts of the societies that have a veto power on the agreement. Spoilers are all the ones that was called hardliners, but I will add to that, they not only hardliners, they are willing to put effort, resources, and most importantly, violence in order to prevent the a mutually acceptable solution by the other side. And in this respect, I want to also say that the external actors are perceived as biased, because if you have demonization and victimhood, so there is black and white, or you with us or you against us. So there is a problem for every arbitrator to be on both sides, or if you say something against me, so you on his side, and this is a very big problem. And there is absence of effective mediation, and this is the first one. And another one problem is the external actors problem, that's like Iran in our problem, all in every other solution, every other of this situation, there were people that have interest and continue and support the extremists on both sides. And now I want to speak about something that is very, very important for me. This is the Plato, I believe that many of you know, Plato's cave allegory. I believe that many know the story about the men that were born in chains, looking only on the shadows on the wall, but one of them escapes and go to see the light, and when he comes back, he knows the truth, but when he comes back, the people mock him that he doesn't see well, and so and this is the basic and most important paradox and problem, because if you are in a conflict and you are, let's say, from, I will say, Hamas, and you understand that the only solution is to accept Israel and live by it, and that the right for return will never be fulfilled. At the same point, you become from a patriot to a traitor, and you will be banished, like the one who came back to the cave. So if you want to have influence, you have to speak their language. most of the consensus language. This is the paradox. You can't change if you don't speak their language, you're a traitor and nobody will listen to you. The third parties suffer from exactly the same problem. The arbiter is if they speak in a language that is different from their language, the people's language, it seems like is no arbiter at all. The solution, the only solution, whenever protracted conflict was civilized and transcended, it when a mobilized elite, a bunch of people, a whole lot of people, were articulates and legitimizes together the required changes. In Israel, I want to remind people that only when you had Rabin and many other security people that said this solution is okay, so the center in Israel could agree upon it. And this is most crucial part, and I want you to remember that alongside a very nice quote from one of the unionist politician in North Island. He said, getting to peace agreements is the easy bit. Putting it into practice is the real challenge. And in Turbulent Peace, the book was written many years ago, very heavy book. He described firstly about the problem that more than 95% of agreements of protracted conflict are in the first 2 to 5 years are wasted. Only very small minority continue and passes this threshold. So putting reaching agreement, this is not the hard part. The solution will come only after 2 to 5 years of good implementation. And for us, it's very important to remember that. So now PMVO, sorry, Ronit. The PMVO, it's a short for politically motivated violent offenders. And we use it to not saying prisoners and not saying anything else, because we want to put as neutral language as we can, because it's very emotional for everybody. One side looks at them as heroes, and one side looks at them as the perfect villain. And Rabin himself said the path to reconciliation passed through prisons. He says that at October 5, 1995. And first, as we said, the PMVO perceived by the state and the official authorities, they treat them as criminal offenders, murderers, or even worse. Even more worse than murderers. They are the embodiment of evil, the embodiment of the demonization of the other side. And of course, in the state part, where you have the victims' families that will do everything that these violent offenders will be punished severely as possible. On the resistance societies, on the other end, they look at them as the embodiment of the national struggle and national identity. They are sacrificed everything the ultimate patriots. And almost everyone in these societies knows someone who has been imprisoned. On the Palestinian society, more than 1 million Palestinians visited jail in some part of their life. 1 million Palestinians. So it means that everyone knows someone from his close family that have been to jail. This is the whole society, what they have done. Now, about the uniqueness of the prison experience. Nelson Mandela is known for his very important sentence that we want to hear from Barghouti and everybody else. We are the right on our side, but not yet the might. Military victory was a distant, if not impossible dream. In this conflict, we don't want the other side to think we are right. We want both sides to understand that the utopian peace is an impossible dream, and that these people can convince their people that a half solution is better than none. And most people don't think about it. I need someone to deliver, and it's called deliverability, because if someone that is less than Mandela is a peace-loving guy that everybody know that he's a peace-loving guy, so nobody listens to him. And if he will try to reach an agreement, he can be killed, or no one will listen to him. So what happens in jail? So first there is something called, it's like socialization, but in jail, so it's called prisonization. It's the reversal of power vector, because they create their own society of resistance, and they create a collective ethics. They run the jail in every one of these conflicts. It happens in Turkey. It happened with the Basques. It happens with the FARC. It will happen with in Sri Lanka. In every one of these places, they turned out to be the leaders of the jail from inside, and they dictated what is happening inside. They create a collective ethics. These communities elevate duty and the role, from every other place you must be devoted, and if you demonstrated devotion by suffering for the group, so you will get reputation and prestige. At the jail, they create the greatest think tank for every one of these conflicts. It's called by many the university in jail, and we're not talking about the open university that the security prisoners in Israel got, but we are talking about the university they create from themselves. They create a schedule from morning to night, and every prisoners that get into prison will get a scheduled syllabus. They'll need to learn to read and write if they don't know, and then they will learn about making bombs or about the history of the conflict. And after this phase, they will start to learn about the enemy and his society, and about his language. And because of that, you will hear that Sinwar knows Hebrew very well, and used to read every day at least 4 newspapers from Israelis. And they create themselves a university in jail, and they do socialization. If you're from the Hamas group, they will socialize you to the Hamas, and if you're from the Fatah, they will socialize you to the Fatah, and if you're Chazit Amamit, they will socialize you to their political perspective. And they create their own research and development department, and we'll discuss the best strategies to continue the conflict, and they become the leaders of the whole struggle. For the Israelis understood it during the first Intifada, when from jail the prisoners prolonged the Intifada for so many years, and everyone that we arrested got into jail, so were socialized, organized, and then came back to the field to continue the struggle. But in these think tanks happens something very, very interesting, because they, during the strategy conversation, and they have this open conversation every day in the cells and between the cells about this open discussion happens because something, if you are a fighter for many years and you suffer, so you can tell everything. You have a status immunity. You can speak out, even abomination, like maybe we'll have to live next to the other side. Maybe we can't kill all of them, and so we must compromise. And this creates, with part of them, different kinds of pragmatism. There is the some of them, like Sinwar, says he have not pragmatism of purpose. He still have this genocidal purpose, but he will be very pragmatic in the way he want to achieve it. And we could see it amazingly well when the jihad last year and 2 years ago shot upon Israel, and Hamas didn't intervene. This is not radicalized ideology. No. This is pragmatism, because he knows that he have a greater target in the in 2 years from now, or 5 years, or 10 years. And another kind of pragmatism that happened in the Fatah movement. It happened in the IRA. It happened in South Africa to Nelson Mandela, that they say we had the right in our side, but not yet the might. Military victory was a distant, if not impossible, dream, and they can say, I'll try to get whatever I can. And this is a different kind of pragmatism and a hope for a solution. And the third part, that is very important to understand, they create network of networks. They are the hub, and every prisoner is a node in this hub, and in this network. And first, the prison is a melting pot. Activists from all locals, clans, classes, sectors, or ideological current, everybody go to this melting pot, and they create in jail, in the Irish jail, in South African jail, in Sri Lanka's jail. They create a national ethos, and very effectively, every one of these, when they talk ideology in jail, every one of these prisoners will convince his local network in Khan Yunis, in Nablus, Shechem, in Khalil, in Hebron, and in Jerusalem. They will talk to their friends, they will talk to their families, and they will convince them. So this elite group of prisoners, the leaders, can convince in consensus, a very interesting process. If they convince all other inmates, and all other inmates convince their local network, so these people can convince a whole society. So, and in this, we come back to the cave. Organized elite that can have the possibility of convincing the whole society. Now, about the implementation. And this is the interesting part. We'll talk about Northern Ireland, a little bit about South Africa, and what happened different in Israel. And the true form of this is not speaking about what happened wrong in Israel, because most protracted conflict, as I said, fall down back to violence. There are very, there is very short list of protracted conflict that that could climb out of this conflict.
Unfortunately, Tomer, we have to conclude as we reached 10 p.m. And so if you're willing, I mean, if you have something to distribute, I could share it with those registered ahead. We'll
Okay,
have to give it another shot one other time. Okay?
Okay.
So I thank you very much for joining us tonight. I do feel this is huge topic. We didn't have enough time to cover it, but we'll be back to give it another opportunity to expand on the topics that we didn't have enough time tonight. And I really appreciate you joining us, and join me in thanking our speakers. And I'm sure there will be other opportunities to hear more about their important research and sharing their knowledge with us. So good night. Thank you.